All right, you guys, welcome to today's webinar session. Hello, dear Venusian staffs and other participants. I'm Dafin, the MC for our webinar session today. We would like to thank you for coming to our webinar session. So today's webinar session is presented by Venusa Tambria School of Design Fashion Club, where they held a sustainability campaign in order to raise awareness regarding the sustainable fashion issues. They have an exhibition that showcases Venus students and alumni's work in contributing to fashion sustainability, located here at 6th floor of FX Sudirman, and in total of 4 webinar series with various topics to discover. So for today, the webinar series are titled as Sustainable Fashion 101 with our guest speaker directly from the United Kingdom, Dr. Alana James, a senior lecturer in Northumbria University, Newcastle. Also, we have our moderator here, Ms. Ratna Dewi Pramita, the head of program fashion design from Venus Northumbria School of Design. So you can give us a round of applause or reaction, something like that. Where are you guys? Okay. There are a couple of mechanisms that all participants must follow. First of all, please mute your microphone when the session is taking place. And second of all, there will be a question and answer session in the end of the webinar series for you to be able to ask questions. Before asking question, you should always raise your hand or type in the chat box below provided. And last but not least, you will be also given an attendance link to be filled before you leave this webinar session. So let's get into it, guys. Ms. Rata, you can start.
Thank you, Davin, for lovely introduction. Hello, Alana. Good morning. You're still muted. Sorry.
Hi, Ratna. You okay?
I'm good. Are you good?
Yeah, I'm good. Thank you. Yeah.
So excited to have Dr. Alana James here. Dr. Alana James is fashion senior lecturer from Northumbria University, UK. So a bit about Alana. Dr. Alana James is the Director of Equality, Diversity and Inclusion for the School of Design at Northumbria University. Within this role, Alana works with staff and students in the department to ensure all treatment and opportunities are fair and equal for everyone. Her work relates closely with her research area, where she specialized in social and environmental sustainability in fashion. Alana strongly believes that garments should be designed and made without causing negative impact to people and also the planet. In her role as senior lecturer in fashion, she focuses on getting students to think about fashion differently, creating innovative solutions towards a more sustainable future for the fashion industry. So we are very delighted to have Alana here as our first speaker from the 4 speaker webinar series that we have regarding the sustainable fashion. So on this webinar, Alana will talk about the introduction of the sustainable fashion. Alana, times and place are yours.
Thank you. Thanks, Ratna. I'm just going to share my screen. Thank you for the lovely introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you all this morning or this afternoon, where you guys are. So as Ratna said, I'm a senior lecturer in fashion at Northumbria, but I also teach quite a lot of business students as well. So when COVID allows, myself and my colleague David spend and are delighted to spend 6 weeks in Jakarta with you all. So we teach the final year students, which has been great online, but we're very much looking forward to coming back to Jakarta sometime soon. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit this morning around one of my passions, my research area, and that is around sustainable fashion. So we're going to be talking about this from an environmental perspective, but also a social perspective as well. And we're also going to talk about what you guys can do as consumers, as potentially business owners, and also as future industry professionals. So to kind of get us started today, I wanted to provide a little bit of context. And I wanted to start with the garment life cycle, because This is where all the environmental and social impact created by the fashion industry occurs. So just to briefly talk over this, obviously we start with the design process, the process that you guys will be very, very familiar with. So it starts with an idea, it starts with some research, some design development, and that kind of execution of that 2D design idea. Once we have that 2D design idea, we can start taking that into a 3D modeling and prototyping process, sourcing materials, going into product manufacture, and eventually through the garment life cycle into distribution. So in an industrial setting, obviously this is done in a factory, often overseas. This distribution model can go from thousands of miles from one side of the world to the other. So once that garment reaches that point of sale, the point of retail, then we can, that product exchanges hands. It goes from the ownership of the company or the brand that produced the garment to the ownership of the consumer, people like yourself and myself who go to shops to purchase fashion products. So once that's in our possession, we start to wear, we start to maintain, we wash, we dry, we hang in our wardrobes, we might repair, but it goes through a series of maintenance. And that kind of area of the garment life cycle can be highly intensive, especially from the perspective of a garment. But once we have finished with that garment, maybe it's come to the end of its usable or desirable life, then we have to start thinking about end of life options. So how do we get rid of that garment? Do we pass it on to a friend? Do we take it to a charity shop? Do we perhaps repurpose it into something else? So this garment life cycle can be very short, or it can also be very long, depending on the ownership model and the type of business model that product comes from. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that later today. But I'm wanting to focus specifically on the fashion supply chain just for a short while. And the reason for that is that during this production process, a huge amount of environmental and social impact occurs. So just to go into a little bit more detail about that, and wanting to, again, just talk very briefly through that fashion supply chain. And again, this will be a process that some of you are very familiar with, some of you less so. So this whole process starts with fiber sourcing. So what kind of fiber do we want our product to be made from? Is it going to be a natural fiber? Is it going to be a synthetic fiber? Or is it going to be a cellulosic fiber? So the choosing and the selection of that fiber is hugely important. And again, the different fiber types have a lot of different environmental considerations. Cotton, for example, is, yes, a natural product, so you would instantly think it would be better, but cotton is a hugely water intensive crop. So again, we have to keep that in mind when we start to make those decisions in our fiber sourcing. Likewise with synthetic fibers, you would think they would be worse because they're essentially plastic and they're from a non-renewable finite resource from the planet. But again, there are some advantages to using these types of fibers when we compare and contrast to some of the alternatives. So once we've kind of sourced that raw fiber, we can go into the creation of a yarn. So the long, thin, cotton-like fiber that allows us to create a textile product. So we go into the spinning and the processing of that fiber into a yarn. And once we have that yarn in whatever fiber type that might be, so it could be cotton, could be polyester, could be acrylic or wool, we go into the creation of the textile itself. So sometimes that is through a knitting process, sometimes that's through a weaving process. And obviously those different characteristics, those different processes offer different characteristics in the final fiber. So any knitted products, they generally have a little bit more stretch in them. So any kind of jersey products, they're essentially knitted. Obviously woolen garments, like I've got on today, because it's still very cold in the UK. Obviously that's a knitted product as well. Woven products tend to have more structure they're less stretchy. So something like a cotton shirt, again, like the one I'm wearing today, that's a woven product. It's got no stretch. It's slightly more crisp. It's more suited to a more tailored product. So these different processes offer different characteristics, and again, are a design decision within the manufacturing process. Once we have our yarn and our textile products, then we can go into the processing. So this might include dyeing, printing, any kind of embellishment. So again, it depends entirely on the type of product being produced. So this shirt, again, for example, will have been printed in fabric form, probably digitally printed, because it's a mass market product. There's no embellishment on it. But it will have had additional extras such as buttons and labeling added in the production and manufacturing process. So once we have that kind of final finished fabric in the form that we're happy with, we can then go into garment production. And that's where we start to really create that 3D product, taking that idea and those materials into something more recognizable as a garment. So again, depending on the type of garment, that can be a very short process. So if it's something like a simple garment, such as a t-shirt, that's a very quick manufacturing process. Or perhaps it's something more elaborate, like a piece of outerwear, coat, a jacket, that will potentially take much longer to produce. So once we have that final finished product, it's bagged and it's tagged and it's shipped or flown anywhere in the world, depending on the global supply chain. So it goes from that point in from manufacturing into retail. So all of a sudden it becomes a commodity, a saleable commodity that is desirable to consumers. So all of a sudden we go into this point of merchandise. The consumer is introduced into this process at that stage. And as consumers, we obviously buy those products from store or online. And as comes to the end of the kind of supply chain process. So that is where we're going to be focusing our conversation today. But with this process, as we've kind of talked about already, it can be very long, it can be very complex, it can be hugely geographical. So it can go from one location right the way to the other side of the world. It can travel many, many miles. And fundamentally, every garment that we own goes through a different supply chain. So a t-shirt will have a very individual supply chain. That t-shirt will differ depending on the brand or the retailer. So the supply chain, when we talk about a fashion supply chain, it's hugely complex and hugely long. And consequently, there are supply chain issues. And this is where we can start our conversations around environmental and social impact. So as we've kind of touched upon already, the supply chain varies widely from garment to garment, from brand to brand. And from fibre to fashion, that product can travel thousands of miles. It can go from cotton sourcing in Uzbekistan that can then be flown to India to be transformed into a fabric. It then might be shipped to Bangladesh to be turned into a garment, and then eventually kind of put on a ship and shipped over to perhaps the US, where that garment will become a commodity and sold as merchandise. So it's very complex, it's very long. And within that process, there is a huge amount of, as I said, environmental and social impacts which can occur. So these are various points and various reasons. So for example, any kind of travel creates carbon emissions. So whether that's by road, by sea, by air, all of these transportation options have considerable carbon emission considerations. Likewise with the sourcing of fibres, like we talked about before, the cotton is hugely water intensive. It's a very land heavy agricultural crop, so it takes a huge amount of space. But on the flip side of that, we have the synthetic fibres, which are produced from finite resources. So all of these processes have environmental impact. But what shouldn't be forgotten here is that there is social implications as well. So within this very long and complex supply chain, potentially hundreds of human beings may come into interaction with that one product that you buy from a shop. So the human element, the social implications within the supply chain are huge as well. And they're often overlooked because they're often quite sensitive issues that people aren't comfortable talking about. Environmental issues are very based on facts. They're based on science. They're tangible factors that can be measured. So people tend to lean towards discussion around environmental issues rather than social. But again, we'll pick up on that a little bit more later on. So within this global supply chain, fashion is the second largest polluting industry in the world, and that is second only to the oil industry. And I'm sure that our perceptions of the oil industry is it's a very dirty, consumerist industry, whereas fashion is potentially very beautiful. It's very contemporary. It's something we all engage with, whether you class yourself as a fashion follower or not. Everybody wears clothing. Everybody buys into the fashion industry. So when we talk about environmental and social impacts, there's different stages that we need to consider very carefully. So we need to think about the resources that it takes to produce our garments. We need to think about how they're used, how they're maintained, how they're cared for. But we also need to think about how they're disposed of. So when it comes to the end of that life, where does that product go? How do we dispose of it responsibly? So from a resource perspective, we've touched on cotton quite a few times already. And I just wanted to provide a few statistics to emphasize these three different areas that we need to consider very carefully. So to produce one cotton t-shirt, it takes 2,720 litres of water during the manufacturing process and the sourcing of the fibre itself. And that's the equivalent of about 3 years of average drinking water for any individual. So huge quantities of water just to produce one cotton product. Again, if we start to consider synthetic fibres as an alternative, approximately 65% of all clothing produced at the moment is made from a synthetic fibre. So a man-made fibre, very reliant on petrochemicals and the production utilising finite resources. So these resources are vital earth sources that will eventually run out. Moving into the use stage, consumers have a huge amount of power within the use phase. It's our decision to wash clothing, to take care of clothing, to repair clothing. So again, it's within our power to make meaningful change. But the use phase, the consumer use of a product is highly intensive in terms of environmental impact. So the washing and the drying of garments has the highest percentage of carbon emissions in the product life cycle, so approximately 40%. So when we think about that in context, we talked about air travel, sea travel, road travel. All those have natural implications of carbon emissions, but it is in fact the washing and drying of the product which is more intensive with carbon emissions than travel and supply chain logistics. Likewise, when we wash a product, thousands of tiny little fibres are released into the water. So whether that's a natural fibre or a synthetic fibre, they're released into our wastewater from our washing machines. So just to give you an example of that, when we're washing 6 kilograms of acrylic garments, which again isn't a huge amount, up to 728,789 fibres can be released. So these are tiny, minute little fibres that you need a microscope to see. However, when we start to think about the quantities of these fibres being reduced in every single wash, the pollution in wastewater is vast. So obviously within our washing machines, we have filters, we have wastewater treatments that again have extensive filtration processes, but 40% of those fibres that are released during our washing processes, they end up in oceans and rivers. Obviously for any of us that eat fish, those fish end up eating those fibers and we eat the fish. So we're essentially eating the fibers that come out of our wastewater during washing. Likewise, we need, I've just seen Ratna's face, it's not pleasant. Likewise, with the disposal phase, we've got to think carefully about how we get rid of that product. So we're going to talk a little bit around consumption levels and overconsumption in just a few moments' time. But 140 million pounds worth of clothing goes to landfill every year. So that's the equivalent of about 300,000 tonnes. Vast quantities of clothing that could potentially be worn again, that could be potentially downgraded to a different product, the fibers which could be probably upcycled or recycled back into the garment supply chain. But when we consider what those garments are made from, so like just a couple of moments ago, we talked about 65% of those garments being made from plastic fibers, essentially synthetic fibers. When we talk about degradability, so if our garments are just going to landfill, it can take between 20 and 200 years for any of those garments to degrade. Let alone when those products do degrade, we have what's called seepage into the soil. So all those chemicals, the dyes, any kind of synthetic chemical products are leaked into the soil, which again affects our ecosystems, it affects our soil ecology, and again has a really negative environmental impact. We're going to come on to fast fashion now. I'm sure fast fashion is something that you've all heard around. It's a market business model that has been around for around 15 years now. And if we look back into history, we can see the escalation of that business model emerging as garment supply chains were offshored, so they were taken overseas, and also the increase in consumption levels. So all these factors kind of contributed to the emergence of what we now know as the fast fashion business model. So fast fashion, just to quickly define what we mean by that, it aims to bring catwalk inspired fashion to the masses as quickly and as cheaply as possible. So the quality of that garment consequently is much lower, and the quality level expected of a fast fashion garment is that it's supposed to be made to be worn and washed only 10 times. So again, it's not a product we're going to keep for long, perhaps a few months maximum, before that garment is falling apart or perhaps got a little hole. If it's a knitted or a woolen product, it might have some signs of wear on the outside, often called pilling. So that garment's going to degrade in quality really quite quickly. So we have a lot of leaders in the market. Within the UK, we have a brand called Primark, and there are kind of fast fashion leaders. They're a company that kind of pioneered and brought they brought that kind of business model to the mass market very quickly. But more globally, we have the likes of H&M or Zara, for example. These are really commonplace international fast fashion brands. So fast fashion has often been compared to McDonald's. It's cheap, it's fast, it's mass produced, hassle-free, but it is also reliant on social and or environmental exploitation. So when we think about that supply chain, we think about how long it is, how complex it is, how many geographical miles that garment from start to finish may have covered. Speeding that process up is only going to result in social or environmental compromise, or in a lot of cases, both. So when we talk about compromise, what we mean is this squeezing, this intensification of all these processes that happen in the garment supply chain. So this was summed up really nicely in a small quote from a prominent British academic called Kate Fletcher. And she said that fast isn't free, someone somewhere is paying. So when we apply that pressure to the garment supply chain, corners are cut, shortcuts have to be made, and it is our environment and our humans working within that supply chain that bear the brunt of that compromise. So fast fashion is, it encourages overconsumption. It encourages us to buy more, to own more, and to wear things for potentially a less amount of time. And the biggest reason for that is obviously cost. Things are cheaper, so we can afford to purchase more products and wear more products. So the level of consumption is vastly growing, it's exponentially growing. And when we think about our consumption levels now in comparison to 30 years ago, they've intensified by 500%. So they are 5 times higher than they were 30 years ago. And one of the biggest reasons for that kind of the considerations around resource use and disposal being so important is because we're still operating in a very linear economy. So what we mean by that is that we go through the supply chain in a very downward trajectory. So we resource the products, we make the products, we buy the products, we use them, and we throw them away. There's no consideration of recycling or reuse or potentially circularity. So discarded clothing, where does it go? What do we do with it? How do we get rid of it? So we've talked about clothing going to landfill potentially already, but there's other options as well. So discarded clothing is causing huge waste issues, not only just in landfill, but also in other countries as well. So countries such as the UK and the US, when we donate or recycle clothing or textile products, they're often shipped to other countries, poorer countries such as Africa or Eastern Europe, who are potentially more in need of those textile products than ourselves. But what that is doing is that it's ruining local economies in these countries. So a consumer in Africa, North Africa, for example, Western clothing from countries such as the UK is much more desirable than a locally produced product. So it's ruining their own local textile economy. Likewise in Eastern Europe. I had a student last year studying with me from Hungary, and she said that within the second-hand market in Hungary, Primark, so those really cheap nasty fast fashion products were hugely desirable because they were from the UK. So again, it's kind of really degrading to those local textile economies. But in order to kind of make a positive change, we can start to think about lengthening our garment ownership, so keeping something for longer. And if we kept just one product for 9 months longer, we can reduce carbon, wastewater, and the emission footprint by 20 to 30%. So again, really small, manageable changes that we can all engage with to reduce the environmental and social impact of fashion. So just moving on to those models of consumption that I mentioned just a few moments ago, we've obviously talked through the linear economy. So we take, we make, and we dispose. But we also have other consumption models to consider within a fashion perspective. We have what's called the recycling economy. So when that garment comes to the end of its desirable or usable life, we've looked to alternatives to throwing that away. So we might pass that on to a friend or a family member. We might donate it to charity. We might sell it. Certainly within the UK, secondhand selling of clothing has again grown hugely in the last 2 years, especially. The COVID pandemic has kind of shifted all our consumption patterns somewhat, and the emergence of this secondhand market has definitely been a result of the global pandemic. So we have websites such as Vinted and Depop. So secondhand sites, a little bit like eBay, where you can go and buy secondhand clothing directly from other consumers. So the recycling economy has huge potential, but it also eventually ends up in landfill. So it's prolonging the life of a garment. but it's ultimately going to be disposed of. But moving more into the contemporary discussions around sustainability, we're moving slowly towards what we call a circular economy. And a circular economy retains the value of any product indefinitely. So there's different ways that this can be done. We can biologically engage with the circular economy. So we can choose fibers which biodegrade and then feed back into our ecosystem in order to produce new fibers. Alternatively, we can go through what's called a technical circular economy cycle, and that's more around recycling and reuse of fibers. So the circular economy, again, has huge potential, but it is a very difficult model for the fashion industry to engage with. And that is because the quality of garments being produced is quite poor to begin with. So actually keeping that value for longer sometimes isn't feasible. But it's also the sheer quantity of garments that we're all consuming. So I just want to, I'm giving Europe as an example here and calling the UK out as one of the worst countries. So the UK has the highest level of consumption of new clothing in Europe. So we currently consume 26.7 kilograms annually per capita. So what that means is every single person in the UK consumes around 26.7 kilograms. Now, obviously, that's an average. Not everybody will engage in that amount of new clothing purchases, but on average, that is the quantity of clothing that consumers in the UK buy. If we compare that to somewhere like Sweden, for example, that's 12.6 kilograms per capita. So again, the differing levels of consumption across geographical locations is vast, and again contributes hugely to the environmental and social impact of fashion. So moving into a more positive discussion, we've talked now about the problems of the fashion industry, and I just wanted to move our discussions to a more positive place. So obviously we're focusing on fashion and sustainability today, but I wanted to differentiate between social sustainability and environmental sustainability. So to start with environmental sustainability, what do we mean by that? What does it look like for the fashion industry? So if we take the literal meaning of the word sustainable, it means capable of being continued with minimal long-term effect on the environment, or pertaining to a system that maintains its own viability by using techniques that allow for continual reuse. So we're talking about a long-term strategy. We're talking about something that can be reused or renewable for a much longer period of time. When we start to think about that within a fashion context, we start to think about clothing being manufactured with little or no impact to the environment, resulting in a system which can be prolonged for future use. So again, one of the biggest problems around sustainability is the lack of definition. So this is a very basic definition, but in terms of governance and standards within the fashion industry, there is very little regulation. So a company can say they are very sustainable because perhaps they have recycled bags, perhaps they use eco lighting in their stores, maybe they use sea freight instead of air freight. But actually, that is very minimal engagement with sustainability. So they can call themselves sustainable, as can a company who is doing a huge amount of positive action within their garment supply chain. They might ensure that they pay a fair living wage. They might use recycled fibers. They might have a strategy for end-of-life disposal of their garments. But these two companies can both say they're sustainable because there is no governance or legislation and definition, working industry definition of sustainability. Likewise, with terminology, sustainability has become a word that means almost everything and nothing all at the same time. It's a bit of a buzzword. People like to use the word sustainable now because we all know it's got positive connotations. But likewise, it can be interchanged with other words as well. So things like green fashion, eco fashion, low impact clothing, or slow fashion. But realistically, each of these have very different meanings, very different implications within the fashion supply chain. So I just wanted to introduce you to a model that I use with some of my students when we're talking about sustainable fashion. And it's the factors that need to be considered when we're discussing sustainability within the fashion industry. So you might have heard of what's called the 3P model, or the triple bottom line. And that refers to the consideration of profit, people, and the planet. And it's said that for any business to engage within sustainability successfully, they need to be profitable, they need to consider people, but they also need to consider the planet. So this star-shaped model around the dimensions of sustainable fashion is based on this 3P model, but it takes it a little bit further. It considers that 3P model in the context of fashion. So in the kind of star-shaped, we've obviously got the 5 points, and I'm just going to talk through those in a little bit more detail. So obviously, acknowledging that 3P model, we need to think about the planet. We need to think about the environmental considerations of fashion. Likewise, we need to think about the social elements of fashion, the human beings that are involved in the production, the use and the disposal of clothing. We also need companies to be economically profitable. They need to be able to make money, to be a profitable business in order to engage with sustainability. But we have two additional factors that are very poignant to fashion and the consideration of fashion products within society. And these are cultural factors. So the fact that every single one of us has a very different cultural background, we have very different values, very different understandings and norms within our everyday lives. We all behave very differently. We purchase very differently. Our values and our positioning of those values is very different as well. But we also need to consider aesthetic. So what does that product look like? Obviously, aesthetics is a hugely important factor within fashion, and it cannot be overlooked when we talk about sustainable fashion as a concept. So it also involves humans. This model takes a very kind of human-centered approach. It doesn't position itself just within kind of business theory or kind of management theory, but it starts to consider that the role that humans play, that consumers play within the engagement of sustainable fashion. It also challenges really outdated stereotypes. So sustainable fashion, it was quite hippie. It was made from scratchy materials. It wasn't very fashionable. So it challenges those things as well by introducing those additional elements of cultural and aesthetic considerations. But I think it also it acknowledges that one model cannot fit all. So it's acknowledges all these different factors, and just because a sustainable model that works for the automotive or the car industry, for example, it can't just be transferred over to fashion. So it's considering the nuances and the differences of the fashion industry compared to other consumer goods markets. So again, I don't want us to forget about the social side of sustainability. So social sustainability is often referred to as ethics. So again, that might be a term that you come across. And the difference between environmental sustainability and social sustainability is that consideration of humans. So again, if we go back to the kind of working definition, it's the study of standards of conduct and moral judgment or moral philosophy. It's the rules of conduct recognized in respect to a particular class of human actions or a particular group or cultural group. So within, again, bringing that kind of definition into a fashion conversation, it's when all human intervention in the clothing supply chain are paid a fair living wage and work under good working conditions. So it's quite a basic request, really. And I think it's something that we're all very accustomed to, and we can often overlook because we are very privileged in terms of often having very comfortable living standards. So it's that consideration of those human beings within that supply chain and ensuring that they are paid a fair living wage and they work under good working conditions. But likewise with sustainable fashion, there's lots of different terminology that can be used here. So it's sometimes called social responsibility or conscious fashion, perhaps. And we often talk about what's termed as ethical consumers. So people who have ethical considerations when choosing products. So they have that empathetic value with their fellow human beings. But to just bring this again back into context in the fashion industry, I just wanted to talk about two very prominent examples of social and environmental issues within the supply chain. So again, these are common examples. You may have heard of them already. Rana Plaza was a garment factory in Dhaka in Bangladesh. It was an 8-story garment factory, and due to faults within the building construction, that factory collapsed and it killed 1,134 garment workers. So nearly 1,200 people who work within our supply chain, making our fashion products, probably not being paid a fair living wage or working under good working conditions, were actually killed for the job that they create. It's been described as the deadliest garment factory accident in history. But if we think about this from an environmental perspective, the Aral Sea is an example that we can talk through. So the Aral Sea is positioned near Uzbekistan. Uzbekistan's a huge cotton making region. It's where a huge amount of cotton is grown due to its climate. And as we mentioned previously, cotton is a hugely thirsty crop. It needs lots of water for its growth and its manufacture. So the Aral Sea went from one of the world's 4 largest lakes to all that water being used and consumed, and is now one of the world's largest deserts. So again, it's an example of that use of finite resources for the production and manufacture of fashion. So it brings me to a question around change. So we've talked through the issues, we've talked through the problems, and we've started to talk about the potential that sustainability or ethical fashion can bring to the industry. But just to emphasize why we need change going forward. Obviously, we've talked about the fast fashion business model, and more recently, we've seen the emergence of what's being called ultra fast fashion. So that's brands who operate solely online. They go directly from business to consumer, and they cut out a huge amount of the kind of middle process within the retail sector. So they can operate more cheaply, they can operate much quicker, and that is being called ultra fast fashion. So the sheer speed of production and consumption and disposal within the fashion industry. Manufacturing working conditions, as we've just seen from the Rana Plaza example, there is a huge amount of human exploitation within supply chains. So that can be anything from not being paid a fair living wage to overtime not being optional, to having to work hugely long hours, to much more drastic measures, such as fire escapes being locked, not being allowed to go to the bathroom, not allowed being allowed to have any breaks, or being part of a trade union. So all these kind of basic human rights being removed from the humans working within the supply chain. But we also need to think about consumption, the sheer quantity of garments that we're all buying and all consuming each and every year. So I've got a little quote for each of these under here, and I'll just refer to the last one on the screen there. So if everyone were to enjoy the same level of consumption as currently enjoyed by the developed world, then we would need the output of 3 planet Earths to support demand. So that's if we continue down the consumption level that we currently have. So again, trying to move on to more of a positive conversation. What can we do to make our consumption and production of clothing more responsible? So I'm going to talk this through in different roles. We all wear very different hats depending on the time of day. Sometimes we're consumers, sometimes we're professionals, sometimes we're students. So I'm going to talk through these in a logical order to think about what we can do, what small incremental changes we can make to make a difference. So as a consumer, we're all consumers. We all buy into the fashion industry in some shape or form. We can think before we buy. So do we really need that item? Do we already have something that will do what we want it to do? Does a friend have something we can borrow instead of buying something new? Or could we perhaps use our skills to make or repurpose something that we already own? So it's thinking about the alternatives. What are the possibilities around avoiding buying just a new garment? We can wear a pre-loved item. So we can buy secondhand or vintage, or as we're seeing at the moment within the market sector, the rental market is vastly growing. This is really taken off in the US. They've got a brand called Rent the Runway, and that's where you can essentially hire fashion products for a certain period of time before giving them back. So it gives you the feeling of having a new product, of buying a new fashion item without actually having to do so. So this is turning into more of a service economy. So just like we stream our music, we stream our video games, our films and our TV series, it essentially moves fashion into a service economy model. You can shop by your values. So as I said earlier, consumers have a huge amount of power. Every time we spend money in a store, we're essentially casting a vote. We're saying that we agree with their values and that we're happy to shop and purchase from that particular brand. So just think about that next time that you choose to buy a fashion product from somewhere. It's a vote and you have the power to change things. We can always also dispose responsibly. So when a garment does come to the end of its desirable or usable life, what can we do with it? Could we repurpose it? Can we think of alternatives to just throwing it away? Can we give it to a friend? Can we donate it to charity? Or could we use the fabric for a new project? A lot of you in the room will be fashion students. You'll be used to spending a huge amount of money on fabric. So when we dispose of garments, you're disposing of something that's really quite valuable as a commodity. But what about as a business? What can businesses do? Some of you might own some of your kind of smaller, more boutique businesses. So these rules will apply to you just as much as some of the bigger corporations as well. So the way that brands engage with good behavior or sustainability and ethics has been labeled corporate social responsibility. So you'll often see brands referring to their CSR activities. And that's essentially any behavior they do for the good of society or the environment. And it very much reflects that 3P model that we talked about earlier. So it's the acknowledgement that companies have to be profitable, but they also need to consider people and the planet. And when we talk about a triple bottom line, what we're referring to is the importance of all three of these factors and acknowledging that we need to consider them in equal measure. So we can't have an imbalance of consideration around profit, for example, if the people and the planet aren't being considered as well. But most importantly, as a future industry professional, many of you in the room are students. You'll be thinking about your future careers and thinking about how you can start to engage in these principles in your practice. So I'm going to leave you today on 3 kind of important points. So the first is to consider the impact of your decisions. So as we've talked through already, there's lots of small changes within the production of fashion that can make a huge difference. So consider what fabric you're choosing, consider how it's going to be made, potentially where it's going to be made, how somebody will purchase that product, how long they will keep it, how are they expected to dispose of it. So it's anticipating those decisions at the design stage before they become an issue later on in the product life cycle. You can design for use and disposal at the beginning. So again, the design process is often looked as a very frivolous aesthetic process. But it's hugely important in creating those decisions and creating those actions right at the beginning of the product life cycle. So 80% of the impact created by any garment is decided at design stage. So again, designers are hugely influential and have huge amounts of power to create positive change. So think about that at the beginning. Again, how is somebody going to use something? How is somebody going to interact or engage, care, maintain, repair, or dispose? Thinking about those things right at the beginning of the creative process. But again, thinking about those consumption models, how can we as designers, as fashion industry professionals, how can we incorporate circular principles? So we know that fashion is slowly moving away from that linear model, that take, make, and dispose. But actually, how can we start to incorporate that into the product? Can we encourage people to repurpose or recycle something at the end of its life? Can we encourage them to bring it back to store to ensure that it's going to be recycled in a positive way? So again, it's thinking around these decisions very early on. It's having the knowledge and the experience and the confidence to be able to make those decisions. And ultimately, it is you guys going out into industry who will be able to change things going forward. So I hope you've enjoyed the talk today. I could talk about sustainable fashion for hours. So that's a very, very small snapshot of kind of the wider discussion around sustainable fashion. So thank you very much for your time. I'd be happy to take any questions anybody has.
Thank you so much, Alana. That's a very interesting presentation.
Thanks.
So, we have 96 people in the room. I'm sure
Wow.
they have so many questions here from the presentation that covers like A to Z about sustainable fashion. So I would like to open the room. You can type on chat box if you are shy, or you can just raise your hand. Okay, while waiting for a question, I have a few questions for you. From your presentation, you talk about the complexity of the sustainable fashion and also how we should be responsible, like choosing our material, fabric. And again, cotton, it's not the best choice overall. No, so as a designers in the future, especially for the students, how can they make a good decision on that?
So there's lots of things you can do. There's lots of sustainable alternatives emerging at the moment. So lots of things from more plant-based products. We're seeing alternatives to leather being made from mushroom and pineapple skin. So really natural kind of waste products that can be transformed into fibers and textiles. But you can also just know about where your fabric is coming from. How has it been made? Where has it been sourced from? Do they have ethical supply chains? So it's that understanding of where things are coming from and ensuring that they're made in a responsible way. So two things: you can either know much more about your supply chain when you're choosing your products, or you can look to alternative fabrics as well.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, we have a question here from Ayu Aprilia. Ayu, can you speak?
Hi, Miss. My name is Ayu. I'm a communication student, batch 2025.
Okay. Can you turn on your video, Ayu?
Okay.
Don't be shy.
Don't be shy. It's okay.
Hi.
There you go. Hello.
Yeah, so my question is from a scale of 1 to 10. 10 is meaning very important. How important is sustainability in fashion today, especially like in Indonesia, how important it is. So yeah, that's my question.
So on a scale of 1 to 10, I would say 25. Okay. It's hugely important. I mean, I think the awareness of the climate emergency that we find ourselves in is the awareness and the knowledge around that is really growing. Especially younger generations such as yourself, you're really engaged with these factors. You're caring for the planet around you. You're understanding that it's really important to look after the world around us for future generations. So we know that fashion is very damaging to the planet. We know that a lot of the processes and procedures that occur are not very sustainable, that we know that they're not kind to humans either. So having that knowledge and having that power to change things is hugely important. And Indonesia is no different. I mean, I've spent quite a lot of time in Indonesia now, and you guys like to shop just as much as we do. So it's about making better choices, slowing down consumption, and really considering the impact of the fashion that we buy. So hugely important. Great question. Thank you.
Thank you, Miss.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ayu, for asking. Any other question? Okay. So, Alana, how do you respond to the big companies now are campaigning for the sustainable fashion? Like they are claiming that they are a fashionable brand, yeah, but actually they are doing a greenwashing.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, there's been a big government initiative in the UK at the moment calling out brands for greenwashing. Like I said before, there's lots of difficulties around standards and governance within the fashion industry. So companies can freely say that they're sustainable when actually they're not. So I think it's a huge problem, because especially when people are just accepting that, they're not kind of calling these companies out or challenging them to actually what they're doing. So it's quite dangerous in a way, because people are thinking that they're making sustainable choices when actually they're just being greenwashed by really big, powerful companies. So again, I think it's, from a consumer perspective, I think you have to do a bit more research. And I know that can be another thing to do, something that we shouldn't have to do. But I think it's really important that you know what the brands are doing that you're buying from. So where do they source their materials? What do their supply chains look like? And most big companies nowadays have really extensive information on their website. Obviously, that's a very biased view and can be potentially greenwashing. So listen to your industry reports, any kind of local activist groups, and the press as well. The press often get to the truth before consumers do. So it's about being critical, not taking everything verbatim, and to really challenge companies with your thinking.
Yeah, so we need to be smart. Have research
absolutely.
on your own. Yeah, that's why we have this webinar learning about sustainable fashion, so you can have your own opinion and judgment to that.
Definitely, it's really crucial.
Yeah. So do we have other question from the floor? Davin, do you have questions? Yes. Sorry, who's speaking?
It's Melvina. I'm from the Venus Batch 23 and a fashion management student.
Yes,
so
Melvina.
My question is, with the amount of demand on garments compared with the limited resources available for sustainability, how can it be balanced to meet the demand with minimum harmful impact to the society and environment?
Sorry, Malvina, you just cut out just a moment there. Can you just repeat your question for me? Sorry.
So the question is, how can you balance the demand that people have for the sustainable brand with the minimum resources? How can you meet the balance of it with the minimum harmful impact to society and environment itself?
Thank you. Sorry, I missed a couple of crucial words when you first asked that question. It is about balance. So I think it's to acknowledge that it's a very complex system that we're talking about changing. So it's cultural, it's societal, it's very business orientated as well. So we're requiring a very dramatic shift in people's thoughts, attitudes, behaviors to be able to bring this to reality. I've heard it talked about a lot in terms of cultural and behavioural changes and similarities with smoking, for example. So obviously smoking used to be very cool, it was very fashionable, it was seen as quite glamorous, but that quickly changed. So we were told about the health implications, society was educated, we then had government bans. So it's almost those incremental steps that need to be implemented in order to create big change. So we're seeing the awareness and knowledge of people growing, which is a great first step. We're being warned by global scientists that we are facing a climate emergency and that we have very little time, a very short window of time to be able to stop really impactful damage to our planet. And we're now seeing small steps from governments to implement these changes. So there is a movement, there is change happening, but it's very complex. And I think small changes that we can all do in our everyday lives can create a bigger change than perhaps waiting for that societal and cultural change to catch up with us. So you're right, it's about balance. We all want new clothing, we all want to feel that we can go shopping, but it's just being more considered in our choices as well.
Okay, thank you, Miss.
Thanks, Lavina.
Okay, so baby step is important. Yeah, whatever you can take for action, just take the action. Do whatever you can do. Okay, so we open for another 2 questions.
I think there's one in the chat.
Okay, we've got from Unita here. Excuse turn off camera, of course, it's okay. So her question is, sustainable products have close relation with cost, and what should we consider and do to produce a relatively cheap clothes, but still consider about sustainability and quality, especially for small, medium enterprise business?
So I think small, medium enterprise businesses have quite a lot of power to change things. So huge conglomerate businesses like H&M, for example, their logistics, their supply chains are vast. And to create change in those, it takes this huge kind of systemic shift to create change. Whereas actually small and medium enterprises have quite a lot of control in comparison to their supply chains. So you can think about where that product's made, how it's sourced, and you can keep that control throughout the supply chain in a much more controlled way to huge global companies, for example. I think there's a misconception around the relationship of cost and sustainability. There's a lot of choices that we can make as consumers that don't cost anymore. Buying secondhand, for example, is often much cheaper than going to a store and buying something new. Likewise, with borrowing off friends, that costs absolutely nothing. You might need to buy them a coffee in thanks. So that there's this. I think there's a lot of misconception around price and sustainability that responsible products cost more. A lot of brands will try and say that sustainability costs more, but actually I think we know that there's lots of different options that we have to more responsible decisions. So Zara's a really I'll tell a little story about Zara. So Zara created the fast fashion business model. Zara are a Spanish brand. They traditionally designed, produced, sold, and consumed all within Spain. So it's a relatively small country, and their logistics were well controlled. They didn't have to ship something hugely far, thousands of geographical miles. So this kind of small production and consumption model worked. But that model was used and abused by lots of different brands, and it's now the global fast fashion business model that we know today. So if we were to bring manufacturing back onshore to more localized economies of scale, so producing much closer to where that product's going to be sold, we can mitigate lots of the environmental and social issues occurred in the supply chain. And again, that's within the power of small to medium enterprises quite often. So kind of bringing it back, scaling it, that big global supply chain back to something much more localized and controllable.
Yeah. I think in Indonesia also we can have that. Yes, we have so many small, medium enterprise, artisan, craftsmen, and we have more opportunity for slow fashion.
Yeah, absolutely, you do. I mean, the UK used to produce huge amounts of garments in the UK, but once that production was offshored, sent millions of miles away across the world, that skill set was gone. So we no longer have the infrastructure or the craftsmanship to be able to do a lot of that. Whereas a country like Indonesia, you absolutely do.
Yeah, true. Okay, one last question from the floor. We have one here from Nicole. Hi, Nicole.
Hi, I'm Nicole. I'm from GDNM, batch of 2024. And my question is, I know there are organizations like I don't know what they call it, but like, you know, how in packages there's like vegan or fair trade or 100% made in Indonesia to certify that these brands are, you know, legitimate. Are there any other official organizations or like, I don't know, I guess like certification or stamps that we as consumers should look for other than, you know, the veganism, fair trade thing to, you know, my question is, are there any other certifications or organizations that we as consumers may not know of and should look out for?
Great question. Great question, Nicole. So yes, there's lots of certifications, and a lot of people say too many certifications that consumers don't actually know what they mean anymore. So there's some simple ones you can keep an eye out for. So there's a standardization called BCI cotton. So that makes it ensures that the cotton that's used within the production of that garment is produced in a fair way, that it doesn't it's not overly intensive in terms of resources. So that's one that's particularly taken off in the UK at the moment. We see BCI cotton on lots of labels. There's also things like B Corp. So B Corp. It means that it's a certified B Corporation, and it means that it's gone through a certain auditing standardization process to ensure that they're a good, responsible company. There's other things like GOTS. GOTS are again a more kind of fabric sourcing standardization. So again, there's quite a few to kind of keep an eye out for. But I think what's really important is to know that a lot of these certifications or standards only apply to a very small part of the supply chain. So BCI cotton, for example, is only the cotton. So it could be made in a sweatshop and mass produced on a huge scale, but it's got BCI cotton. It's a little bit like when companies say that it's made from recycled polyester. If you actually look at the label, there might be a very, very small percentage of recycled polyester. So again, it's being a bit clever. It's being a bit critical about these claims. Have a little look into it. Try and have the knowledge yourself to be able to say, actually, that's only 12% recycled polyester. So it's not as great as it sounds. So there's lots of things that you can look for.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, Nicole. Great question.
Okay, thanks, Nicole. Okay, that was the last question from Nicole before we close the session because time is up. So to sum up what we have talked before, we talk about A to Z about sustainable fashion. Yeah, Alana talks about the cycle for the fashion, the supply chain, from the fiber ecosystem to spinning to garment production, retail to consumer, yeah, how complex the sustainable fashion is and the issue is, and how fashion is a very polluting industry in the world. And we talk also about the resources, the making process, and the usage and disposal, and the negative impact to the environment. Also, we talk about we talk about fast fashion, who adapt the catwalk in mass-produced consumer very quickly and as cheap as possible. We talk also about the model of a linear and circular economic, recycle economic, and we also talk about 5 dimensions of sustainable fashion, where we have environmental, economically profitable, aesthetic, and cultural background that everyone has differently, also norms, behavior, social, and ethics. So from this webinar, I hope you enjoyed today's session, and I hope you're becoming more responsible and conscious into the sustainability and the complexity, of course, of this very serious issue. So from the present for a better future. I think that's all from me. Thank you so much, Alana, for being here. Such a pleasure.
Thank you for hosting. Yeah. Good to see everyone.
Thank you. So back to Daphne.
All right, you guys, thank you to Dr. Alana James and Ms. Rata Pramita for sparing your time in order to deliver this valuable information for us who would have known sustainable fashion is very much a lot of information, yeah? I would also like to thank the participants who have joined our webinar session here of Sustainable Fashion 101. We hope that this webinar brings great knowledge and experience for each one of you. The theme will be Sustainable Roots of Jada Wastra. Make sure you guys stay tuned for infos and especially check out the Instagram at fashion.bnsd for further information. And also prior to leaving this webinar session, please don't forget to submit the attendance form in order to claim your SAT points for Binusian and e-certificate for all participants. If you have submitted the form, you may leave this room. And of course, I'm Daphne. Stay healthy and stay safe. Thank you, guys. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks
so much. Thanks, Alana. Bye.
Bye.
Take care.